Hello and welcome. I am Daisy, your hostess. You're joining me for the book titled The Magic in Your Mind. It is written by U.S. Andersen. It is in the public domain. I want to say thank you so much for joining me. If you are here in my community, I appreciate your comments and your feedback, your recommendations as well. If you are new to the channel, welcome. If you'd like to catch up with the previous chapters of this book, please visit my book playlist and access them there. There are a lot of golden nuggets in this particular book, very helpful for anyone that is trying to understand themselves, to also understand their place in the world, and also how to tap into their innate abilities. And with that, we'll go ahead right into Chapter 9, Developing Skills. Each man contains all possibilities within him because he is a manifestation of an eternal and infinite being. P.D. Ouspensky states, "Everything exists always. There is only one eternal present, the eternal now, which the weak and limited human mind can never grasp and conceive. Our mind follows the development of possibilities always in one direction only. But in fact, every moment contains a very large number of possibilities, and all of them are actualized. Only we do not see it and do not know it. We always see only one of the actualizations, and in this lies the poverty and limitation of the human mind. But if we try to imagine the actualization of all the possibilities of the present moment, and then of the next moment, and so on, we shall see the world growing infinitely, incessantly multiplying itself, and becoming immeasurably rich, and utterly unlike the flat and limited world we have hitherto pictured to ourselves." Clear channel to universal mind. A man may develop any skill he desires. The essence of his nature is to grow in the direction indicated by the images that form in this consciousness. Some people are born with a clear channel from one facet of their consciousness into universal mind, and they are gifted. They are our Balzacs, our Mozarts, our Einsteins, our Galileos, our Michelangelos, and though they are superhuman in one corner of their natures, in all sense they are normal and subject to the same weak and ineffectual vision as everyone. Such unearned perception of universal mind is sometimes more a curse than a blessing, because the person possessing it expects illumination in other areas also, and is frustrated at being unable to find it. Rage and self-hate may grow out of such an unbalanced nature. Van Gogh cutting off his ear is an excellent illustration, and an artist's temperament, when gifted with genius, is often manic-depressive, alternating between periods of elation and self-debasement. The skills that we earn are the skills that delight us. Nothing in life is so exquisitely satisfying as the mastery of a skill. Whatever we do well adds to our stature as persons, increases our scope and effectiveness. From birth to death we acquire countless skills, use them daily, perform them unthinkingly because they have become part of our nature. We learn to walk, we learn to run, we learn to talk, we learn to read, we learn to figure, we learn to cook, we learn to sew, we learn to drive, we learn to run a business. And the kind of persons we become and our effectiveness as human beings have a direct bearing on the number of skills we have mastered. People say, "Oh, I could never develop any skills. I don't have any talent." Well, lack of natural ability is no reason for curling up your toes and playing dead. The most important thing in life is growth, and it makes no difference where you start and the scale of capability. What is important is that you do not stay there, but progress. There is a quality in the psychic makeup of man that, when impressed with desire and a picturization of that desire, immediately sets about opening his eyes to the possibilities for achieving it in the material world. Knowing this, we eventually come to have deep faith that the thing which we think about will become part of our lives. Modern Pied Piper. The man with the voice of a bullfrog probably will never give a concert at Carnegie Hall, but if he spends the major portion of his life learning to be a singer, he will be able to perform quite credibly someday. None of us lives long enough to develop completely in all directions. For this reason, the secret self created multitudes of individuals, and through this multiplicity seeks expansion in all areas. The individual himself functions best when he is able to determine those abilities most natural to him and then sets about developing them to their highest possible level. To do this, he needs insight, and he most certainly needs to be free of mental blockages. A man sometimes seeks to develop his business ability because he desires to have money, when in truth he might find more fulfillment in other fields. The end-gaining philosophy that has become predominant in our civilization is a Pied Piper leading us down streets of frustration. One who works only to gain a result is seldom happy and almost never works well. He finds no pleasure in his task and no satisfaction in their growth possibilities. He can hardly wait to get on from one moment to the next because the only time that has any meaning for him is the time when his goal is reached. Should he never reach it in his life, is hemmed in with bitterness through having sacrificed all for something that never materialized. It is better to lie on your back and look at the stars than to chase shadows, if the chasing is not fun. A little child can run after illusions and take delight in every moment, but the man who pursues a wraith and is bound to it begrudges every ounce of energy expended in attempting to bring his illusory target to earth. 3 laborers were asked what they were doing. The first said, "I am working." The second said, "I am digging a ditch." The third said, "I am helping build a canal." Obviously, the third man took the most satisfaction from his labor because he saw what his work would create and he was glad to be part of it. One who labors only to make a living puts in time that he wishes were gone, begrudges the hours he must spend at his tasks. He looks at the clock at 10 and wishes it were noon, and he looks at the clock at 3 and wishes it were 5. He actually wishes away a large part of his life. Longing for mastery. It is not nearly as important that we possess a skill as it is that we desire to possess one. The longing for mastery is the key to the motivation of the secret self, the very basis of evolution, of each form's tendency toward unity with its creator. Life is fluctuating and change, a constant cycle of growth and decay, and we have to aspire to be better than we are, even to stay where we are. And the moment self-satisfaction comes to us, our disillusion begins. Constant excitement and challenge come to the man who seeks mastery. Every situation confronts him with opportunity, for he sees in each an opportunity to develop a part of his nature. Whenever he meets an obstacle, he knows his knowledge is inadequate, and he sets about at once to rectify this deficiency. He learns everything he can because he sees the bond common to all knowledge. Eventually, he learns easily and well, for he removes all limitation from his mind and, like a sponge, draws the knowledge needed for effective works and actions. We have to love the things we do in order to do them well. We have to like to perform the work regardless of the result. We have to not even care about the result and take our entire satisfaction from the action. When people have undergone great shocks, such as prolonged exposure to death and danger, or the loss of a limb, or the death of a loved one, they often turn to work for work's sake as a preoccupation for their minds, and thus they discover one of life's deepest joys. A child finger painting in a kindergarten class puts colors on paper with no idea of a result, and this engrossing of his whole nature makes him part of the work he does and the work part of him. Mental hospitals have discovered the therapeutic value of putting patients to work at easels or with needle and thread or even in the garden, for surrender of self-concern to the task at hand rids the person of his tormenting ego, and he is able to get completely outside himself through becoming part of the work he is doing. we develop our skills through an inner love for the action involved. We will become musicians if we love music. We will become writers if we love writing. We will become builders if we love construction. We will become businessmen if we love commerce. But we become nothing simply through a desire to be famous and rich. Such false desires are products of the ego. Even the slightest look at them gives us evidence of their insubstantiality. If we undertake to be a businessman, for instance, and we run into difficulties and our reaction is one of depression and failure, we can be sure that we were led into our business endeavors in the first place through an egoistic desire to be better or more powerful than others. The businessman who loves business glories in his moments of trial, for it is then that he develops more understanding, more mastery. Since he loves business, he loves it when its nature is most acute, and therefore his times of trial are a joy. Such people inevitably are successful because they cannot be discouraged, because they love the thing that they're doing, whether it is going badly or well. They are unaffected by apparent turns of defeat and fortune, assure their own growth through having taken their eyes from the goal and becoming engrossed in the doing of their work. We learn by doing. Learning to do a thing well is primarily a matter of performing it endlessly until all the ramifications of its action seep down into subconscious levels and allow one to perform unthinkingly. It is difficult to fly an airplane when one does not know how. To the earthbound man, flight in a plane operated by his own hands seems almost unthinkable. When he takes his initial ride, he at first is frightened, then exhilarated, sensing his transcendence of nature's law of gravity. Soaring high above it, the landscape, he feels like a bird, arrives at a sensation of flying far removed from any previous experience on passenger liners. Then he may bridge the gulf between his earthbound limitation and his aspiration toward the sky, and he may decide to become a pilot. The first time up, he is clumsy and awkward, tense and ineffectual, seeing all too clearly that if his instructor were not present, the plane would fall and crash into the ground. This sense of being poised between life and death with no one to look to but himself may prove to be one of the most significant experiences of his life. If so, his eventual mastery of the airplane is assured. Seeking understanding in an area hitherto hidden from him, his growth in that direction is inevitable. Soon he will find himself alone in the airplane, flying it freely and confidently, transcending the limitations of his own thinking. His exhilaration then will know no bounds. Always we learn by doing. No amount of information injected into a man by books and lectures will make him the master of a skill. A skill is its own teacher, and each of us who aspires to mastery must become an apprentice. Ideas, facts, and abilities all come to the man who seeks to make himself more proficient, whether his field is creative, administrative, executive, or simply the performing of labor. If he dedicates himself to a task for the love of doing it, eventually he will find himself highly capable. When we attempt to learn a new skill, our initial efforts are always inept, and the ego-conscious man often is stricken with discouragement and sometimes gives up further effort altogether. The enlightened man will not be dismayed by his initial ineptitude. He will know he is coming to grips with a new knowledge that will take time to seep down into subconscious levels. Educating the subconscious. The person who buckles on a pair of ice skates and ventures out onto a frozen pond for the first time is a sight to behold. His arms flail and his ankles bend. He fights desperately for balance, swoops forward and backward in a hair-raising battle to stay upright. He can neither start himself when he's stopped nor stop himself when he's moving. And the only certain thing about his performance is that he is bound to wind up on the seat of his pants. Compare this novice skater with an Olympic champion. It seems incredible there could be any comparison, but there is. Not too many years ago, the Olympic champion was just such a novice, and his proficiency today is only testimony to the power of the subconscious to direct the actions of body and mind with the utmost symmetry and perfection. When we try to do something difficult or something beyond our ordinary grasp, we must first come to grips with it consciously by focusing our attention upon it. This period of conscious striving produces a tension within the psyche that stimulates subconscious activity, directing relief of the tension, producing resolution, giving dimension and control to the organism. The more conscious the striving, the more tension produced in the subconscious, and the more the subconscious works to effect answers to the problem that confront the individual. The man who is handicapped by poor speech and uncertain delivery might desire to become a platform speaker and set his conscious striving toward that end. His initial period of effort will produce little noticeable result because his ineffectuality cannot be solved by his conscious mind. He cannot be given a confident, dynamic delivery simply by thinking about it. A reason will not provide the effects he seeks, and no amount of study a happy solution to his problems. But as he delivers speech after speech, as he continually works himself through the same blunders and errors, his suffering and consequent need produce such tension in the subconscious that one day, of a sudden, he will find himself delivering a direct and dynamic speech with the power and clarity that heretofore had eluded him, turning effort into instinct. We develop our abilities when we make continued efforts to improve ourselves and never cease in the continuity of these efforts, no matter how little progress we seem to be making. We can never judge our progress anyhow, for the simple reason that all real work is done on subconscious levels, and we may be transported from very low to very high in one sudden, sublime moment of insight. A young housewife recently told the story of how she came to be an accomplished pianist. "I had been laboring at the piano for 4 years," she said. "I had gotten to the point where I was able to play a number of compositions, but they were all wooden, came out with no feeling, seemed to lack rhythm. The few times that I played for my friends, I was actually embarrassed at their having to listen. I practiced every day, though sometimes as much as 3 hours. It seemed incredible that I made so little progress. I had always learned other things easily, but playing the piano seemed too much. Eventually, I became convinced I had no music talent. One evening at a party, a friend suggested that I play. A refusal rose rapidly to my lips, but suddenly I was overcome with the most wonderful feeling that I would be able to play well. I cannot say just how the feeling came. It certainly did not form itself in so many words. I just knew deep within myself that I would be able to play well, and I had a sudden insight into the relationship between the music and myself. The piano, the keys, the notes, and the sheet music all blended together and merged with me. I knew that when I sat down and began to play, I would play well because I would be performing outside myself and wouldn't have to think about it. When I sat down at the piano, I played exactly as I envisioned it. The guests applauded and gathered around, and I played the rest of the evening. I have been playing well ever since, and the whole thing taught me a great lesson. We must never quit when we seem to be making no progress. We may go from the most inept novice to the most accomplished performer in that single moment when the hours of our efforts break through and merge with our instincts. A man sets out to do a thing because he is impelled by the images in his mind. He is driven to the performance of the work that needs to be done, and he cannot rest as long as one iota of the task is unfinished. Yet he does not work simply to gain an end. He is engrossed in his task just as it is engrossed in him, and his actions are performed with an inner joy, for he knows he's doing what he should be doing. He takes complete enjoyment from each day because each day delivers him all the desires, the work he loves, his performance in it, and the growth of his knowledge and capabilities. A quote from the Sanskrit. Look to this day, for it is the very life of life. In its brief course lie all the verities and realities of your existence, the glory of action, the bliss of growth, the splendor of beauty. For yesterday is but a dream, and tomorrow is only a vision. But today well lived makes every yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Look well, therefore, to this day. End of quote. The only real security. One skill that people seem most desirous of developing is that of making money. But making money is not a skill. It is the result of a skill. Money sought for itself will surely prove to be most elusive. It is not evil. It is good. Good because it representative of work. But those who attempt to take it by avoiding work are corrupting its true purpose and shrinking their own natures. Henry Ford made this statement: "If money is your only hope for independence, you will never have it. The only real security that a man can have in this world is a reserve of knowledge, experience, and ability." As a young man, Ford had little money, but he was sustained by the vision of his automobile, and his days and nights were full of work and thought. When that day arrived that every 10th family in America owned an automobile, Ford became a rich man. His fortune came to him not because it had been sought, but because he had rendered a service to millions of people. In our day and age and society, wealth is a natural result of serving a large number of people. All work is repaid in kind, and when we serve one person, he serves us also, and this owing of service usually results in the exchange of money. If we serve one person, we are paid so much. If we serve 2 people, we are paid more. If we serve 10, even more. If we serve 1,000,000, we are bound to become wealthy. We cannot help but create wealth when we find a work that needs to be done, and we cannot help but receive a portion of this wealth ourselves. That money breeds money is axiomatic, but only when such money is put to work creating wealth. When our savings are invested in activities that promote discovery and creation, they cannot help but make money, for they are being used in accordance with this primary law of life, that every service must be rewarded. Proper performance is always unthinking performance. Any other kind of action is ego-centered and based upon partial knowledge. A friend reports he can cut an apple exactly in half when he is not thinking about it, but when he concentrates, the halves no longer match. Innate in each man is an original mind, and knowledge there is not limited to that acquired through the senses. Egoistic conditioning causes mind to acquire a fixed idea of itself as a means of controlling itself, and consequently, a man thinks of himself as I. The focus of his consciousness then shifts from original mind to ego image, and it becomes impossible for him to use original mind in any of his mental actions. Everything performed in response to the ego is intentional, affected, limited, and insincere. We have to learn to let intention go, to let sense of self go, so that we can perform under the impulsion of a greater mind and will. We must learn to be spontaneous. We must learn to give up plan and effort, to do the natural thing when the time for performance arises. Spontaneous action. Basic in Zen Buddhism is the doctrine of unintentioned action. A Zen Buddhist disciple, an archer, is reported to have practiced for 3 years to let his arrows shoot themselves. When at last he was able to release the bowstring unconsciously, in response to an intuitive action that had more to do with the target and arrow than his purpose, the effectiveness of his archery increased amazingly. But the moment he began to think of results, he no longer was able to let the arrow shoot itself. and his scores fell off at once. Spontaneity is the mark of the absolute. Universal mind does not need to think out things. It holds within itself at every moment the proper answer to each particular problem. It acts quickly and without thought. That which we do well, we do without effort because we have given over the doing of it to a will and power that lie outside our conscious intentioned ego. Developing a skill is largely a matter of abdicating from performance. We must learn to let go personal responsibility and conscious control. Henry Miller wrote, "When you dwell on the prophetic, you come to realize that there is an invisible pattern to the events which mold our destiny, and that history, philosophy, science, art, religion yield but a distorted, meaningless, even ridiculous image of this divine web. But the most interesting aspect of this experience, this lifting of the veil, is that all desire to modify, hasten, or retard events is nullified. What is, what will be, and that suffices. Merely to recognize, if only for a moment, that there is a greater plan, enables one to abdicate. In abdicating, one is not removed from the stream of life, even mentally. One plunges in more deeply, more wholeheartedly. That is the curious thing. All that is sacrificed is one's limited, egocentric view of life, a view which caused one to swim against the current instead of with it. A juggler keeps 8 balls in the air, and people exclaim, "Isn't that incredible?" And it certainly is if we assume that the conscious mind is controlling the action. The conscious mind can hardly follow the action, let alone perform it. Juggling 8 balls is done by the subconscious, which directs all activity that takes on the coloration of skill or talent. This mind is not a multitude of minds, but only one. Therefore, all skill and all talent reflect the activity of a single person. All books are written by the same author, all pictures painted by the same artist, all music composed by the same composer. In every creative activity or accomplished performance, the same mind is responsible. A thing done well reflects the direction of the divine, and thus spiritual awakening is necessary for effective living. The secret door. As long as we live and act in the ego, we cannot hope to develop our talents and capabilities except in the most limited manner. When you set out to learn something, you must first get yourself out of the way. This I that you constantly refer to, the sense of self that sits directly behind your eyes, is egoistic in the sense that it is separate and will prevent your learning anything well as long as it controls your consciousness. There is a great deal of difference between egoistic trying and letting action develop through spontaneous impulsion from the secret self. Effort made through the ego develops because the ego has some result in mind. It wants to feel better than others, wants to control them, or it is afraid or hostile or insecure. And this end-gaining action, so limited in viewpoint and knowledge, has only the barest chance of succeeding, and then only by coincidence with the purposes of the secret self. People try and try to master some skill and make only the barest progress. They finally despair and give up altogether, and this giving up, this release of the end-gaining aims of the ego, is exactly the time that skill may develop in them because the secret self takes over. Examples of this psychological phenomenon are so profuse as to be irrefutable. Pasteur, laboring over test tubes and microscopes, receiving his greatest illumination in the period of his greatest hopelessness. Galileo was inspired with the idea of a revolving solar system at the nadir of his despair over the ineffectuality of his telescopes. Every researcher knows that a secret door is often found on a dead-end street. Every creative artist knows that his greatest work comes after periods of intense frustration. That is always darkest before the dawn is a well-known saying. We have to have our egos reduced to nothingness before the secret self takes over. We have to get ourselves out of the way so that skills can develop in us, so that work can be done through us by a greater mind and being. How often have you wadded up a piece of paper and unthinkingly tossed it across the room and been amazed when it landed directly in the center of the wastebasket? You may have wadded up other pieces of paper and tossed them at the wastebasket without a single further hit, and probably you shrugged your shoulders and wrote off the first hit to luck. Well, it wasn't luck at all. It was simply that you performed the action without the interference of conscious mind. In effect, you allowed the paper to propel itself at the wastebasket with yourself as only a medium of impulsion. This kind of psychic unification of the basket and the paper and the propelling energy allowed all elements in the action to become one piece, and anything occurring within that unity had to have perfect symmetry and be absolutely effective. Becoming one with our tasks. Now, if there is one mind common to all things and exclusive to none, it follows that we basically are all part of a single organism, and our effectiveness within that organism depends upon our recognition of this fact. As long as we view ourselves as separate selves, we are moved by the delusion of egoistic desire and thus led into opposition to the will of the secret self. Any action that is conceived in the ego and entered into for egoistic purposes, if not doomed to failure from the outset, can result in only mediocre success. Its entire purpose and impulsion arise from a limited knowledge, set against the ocean of knowledge that is universal mind. We learn to do things well by becoming one with them, by so engrossing ourselves in our tasks that we pick up a sense of unity with them. This sense of oneness is impossible to the egoistic nature for the simple reason that the ego itself is a sense of separateness. When we become completely absorbed in things, we have a true spiritual experience. For by this psychological transference of self, we plunge deeply into universal mind and become the work that we are doing. Everyone who has great skill or talent goes daily to this fount of forgetfulness, plunges in and is renewed, and the temple of his religious worship is his own talent. Henry David Thoreau wrote, "If one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with unexpected success in common hours." Thrusting against pain. All barriers to accomplishment are in mind. Education itself teaches limitation, and history establishes a definitive level that suppresses human aspiration. For years, 4 minutes was thought to be the fastest time that any man ever would run the mile. Then along come a group of Australian milers with a new philosophy, and they broke down the mental barriers, and now any number of men have run the mile faster than 4 minutes. This new philosophy might as easily be applied to any area of human activity. It is built around the premise of thrusting against pain, on the idea that pain represents a limitation in the mind. Those who train under this system drive themselves to run farther than they think they can, asserting the principle of mind over matter to do away with fatigue. Such a philosophy releases a human being from all barriers. Nothing is impossible to him as long as his guiding principle is to surmount each obstacle he encounters. Directional drive is the most important single factor in achievement. Outstanding boxers are culled from the social groups that have to fight hardest to survive. Heads of corporations and governments' executives are often born in the most humble circumstances, and their climb to the top is allied directly to their dedication. Heaven attends the man who throws his heart into his work. In his absorption, he loses his egoistic sense of self and becomes a clear channel for the energy and creativeness of universal mind. Constant aspiration. The usefulness of goals depends on their ability to remove limitation from our thinking. A man exceeds himself by aiming higher than he has ever aimed for. It is not the goal that is important. It is the aiming higher. When a goal is reached, it actually becomes a limitation unless replaced by a higher goal. The man who achieves something and spends any time patting himself on the back is nullifying his growth. For when self-complacency enters the nature, ego grows and the individual stagnates. If we don't try to exceed ourselves, we disintegrate. If we do not try to be better, it is impossible for us to even stay as good as we are. The dynamic forces of life are growth and decay, and nothing is static. Things move in one direction or the other. A few years ago, a young man emerged from an automobile accident paralyzed from the neck down, except for the rudimentary use of the forefinger of his right hand. As he lay abed and pondered his situation, he resolved to develop some skill with that right forefinger. He had a typewriter rigged on his bed, with his right arm slung before it so he could peck at the keys with his forefinger. His initial efforts, very excruciatingly slow, and required great concentration and resolve. He labored for hours to type a single sentence. As the weeks turned into months, he was able to type a page, then two, finally a dozen or more. After a year, he not only was typing proficiently, but was actually sitting up in bed to do it. Today, he gets about with crutches and has embarked upon a program of total rehabilitation. He seems well on the road to recovery. Such tenacity and purpose might be expected to belong to a very grim person, but this young man has deep humility and a wry sense of humor. When asked how he has been able to accomplish such miraculous results, he stated, "I was given this body, and I banged it up. The least I can do is put it back in the condition I found it." Men have searched out the trackless wastes of the poles, journeyed to the depths of the seas, flung themselves miles into the air, and now contemplate journeying amongst the stars. Who can say that anything is impossible to the mind and effort of man? There exists within him a power to imagine a better world than the one in which he lives, and he never ceases attempting to find it. Our imagination should be treated with precious care, for it is the tool of our liberation from the bonds that hold us. We can be anything we are capable of visualizing, do anything we are able to imagine, for the images that form in our minds inevitably lead us into the work that effects their realization. Inner acceptance. Skills are developed by faith that one possesses the skill already. This a priori inner attainment of the skill allows the individual to act as if it were impossible for him to fail. He still will go through a period of ineptness, but such ineptness will not stay with him. He will surmount all fear, all ineffectuality, for he is sustained in all circumstances by an inner vision that he already has accepted as reality. If a man aspires to an ability, he becomes accomplished only after inner acceptance. No one can ever be any better or greater than his mental visualization. If we accept ourselves as exactly what we already are, it becomes impossible for us to improve. To become better, we must think we are better, not in the egoistic sense of thinking that something is our due, but in the wider spiritual sense of realizing that all things derive from the image within. Such psychic positioning of the ego releases it from bondage to itself and allows it to accept on faith the fact of its wider being and effectiveness. Skillfulness is primarily a matter of becoming an instrument for the action of a greater mind and will. Any egocentric effort to dominate the world or to originate action from the standpoint of the surface mind immediately raises the problem of the ego controlling itself. Any system of self-control, inasmuch as it approaches perfect self-control, also approaches perfect self-frustration. For control implies keeping something from doing what it normally is disposed to do. The idea of acting in accord with our nature meets with objections on every hand. Taking the restraints off human nature supposedly would be like letting loose a swarm of locusts. Religious and social groups have adopted the idea that man is more a work of the devil than of God, that his bestial nature must be held in restraint by laws and inhibitions. Thus, duality is forced upon man. The necessity of presenting one face to the world while living in solitude with another, and it is responsible for more mental and physical ailments than all the microbes ever discovered. Be yourself. We present one face to the world and behold another in the privacy of our rooms, and this knowledge that we are not what the world expects us to be manifests in a kind of social conscience that makes cowards of us all. Most of us are afraid to be ourselves. Like chameleons, we change colors to suit our backgrounds. Our opinions are formed by what people expect us to think. Our behavior patterns are based upon how people expect us to behave. And since we are always thinking in response to outside circumstances, we scarcely know how we feel at all and never have any sense of self other than the one reflected in the eyes of others. To thine own self be true, wrote Shakespeare, and it shall follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man. It is important to act in accord with your own nature. When you live sincerely and feelingly, you become a pure channel for the expression of the divine. Each of us is accorded a unique individuality. As long as that individuality is unhampered by inhibition and fear, it is capable of expressing something different and vital. But when it is restricted and limited by apprehension, it cannot express itself at all. The dammed up torrent of universal energy then turns upon itself, and the dual sides of the ego nature, like the gingham dog and the calico cat, eat each other up. Countless people are restrained from learning because they are afraid to try. In them is a false pride that is connected directly to the ego, and it will not let them perform awkwardly because it has no humility, and it will not let them begin anything and be novices because it cannot stand any idea of itself that is not better than others. If a man be rid of ego self and have accepted that he is only an instrument of divine will and action, he is able to embark upon the learning of a skill with the utmost humility and deep indifference to the opinions of others. He can be laughed at without shame. He can be jeered at without ridicule. He can laugh at himself. He can ridicule himself, but all the while his vision burns brightly, and he knows that one day he will have the attainment of the skill. He has no fear, for fear is possible only to the ego, and the ego has been subordinated in his nature. He embarks upon all enterprises with courage, persistence, and faith. Just because he toils endlessly at the door of creation, that door eventually yields, and marvelous works are wrought through him because his hand is moved by the divine. Whatever your aspiration, remember this: the master of that skill is within you. He who already possesses it is greatest of all. Give over the doing of your work to him and get yourself out of the way, and you will find that you are soon performing with consummate knowledge and skill. End of chapter. If you haven't done so, please do hit that like button. Leave me your comment. Also, if you find this valuable, share it with your friends and let me know what was your takeaway from this chapter. What was the golden nugget for you? And subscribe to the channel to get more notifications of upcoming videos. As a matter of fact, let's head over to the next video for Chapter 10, Creating Your Own Talent.